without further ado, we'll dive right in. We have Steve Wilson here. He is the former head of marketing for Apple Podcasts, the current chief strategy officer for QCode. And we have my friend Ian Wheeler here. He's the co-founder of Partisan Records, the co-founder of Talkhouse, and the publisher of Talkhouse and Talkhouse Media. He is a College of Charleston graduate, and we're super excited to have them today. So let's please welcome our guests. Ian, since you're the graduate, let's start with your journey from being on campus, coming to visit me, and then making your way to New York. And then pause there.
My story is super annoying because it's like very wanderlusty. But I went to CFC when I started here. I came to Charleston to sail on the College of Charleston sailing team. And first week, absolutely hated it. Not made for team sports whatsoever, which I always knew, and just didn't square up in my brain. But thankfully, there was a guy at the sailing center named Colin Bentley. It was amazing, and kind of pulled me aside one day and said, "You seem like you don't like this. Why don't you come work with me?" And so he gave me a job at the sailing center. I worked there for 5 years and, paid my way through College of Charleston, which was great. And one day, I had an advisor here who was a lovely person, awesome. But I was I had an inkling that I wanted to work in entertainment. And somehow I kind of found Stan. He was here at the college teaching. And I think I could never get into his class because of my schedule teaching sailing. But he kind of became my de facto advisor. And the part of the story that kind of sucks, just for you to hear, is it was Father's Day one year, and I was working at the sailing center by myself, and Stephen Colbert came down with his son and was like, "I'd like to take a boat out." So I took him out sailing, and at the end I was like, "I want to work in entertainment. What do you suggest?" And he was like, "Move to New York, I guess." And then I went and saw Stan, and I said, like, "Is this viable? Should I do this?" And he was like, "Sure, why not?" So I did, and Colin Bentley at the college lined up a job for me teaching sailing in New York. And 2 weeks later, I was up there and crashing with friends, and found an internship at Rough Trade Records and started learning the record business. And I was kind of doing it here already, just very haphazardly with local bands and printing CDs in my room and labeling them and selling them at shows. But yeah, my story is kind of annoying because it's pretty unlikely in a lot of ways.
Well, you were following your instinct. It's some passion there. And
yeah, I mean, the nice thing was that there were people here like you and like Colin who were looking out for me. And I knew early on I wanted to do something where it wasn't like I was going to go to law school. There wasn't like a very clear path to get there. So I was kind of feeling my way around and trying different things, and I had a lot of help in you and Colin to kind of, set me up in situations, where I could learn and benefit.
Steve, in your case, there are a lot of students here from South Carolina or from parts of the country who maybe never visited Silicon Valley or the West Coast, and they may not even understand how do you connect with a company like Apple, something on that scale. It can be intimidating. What was your journey to make your way to Apple? I know you had a very interesting story about the application process itself.
Yeah, good afternoon. So I actually made my way into Apple via Apple Retail. So shortly after I graduated from college, I was thinking of going to law school, trying to figure out all of that, and had just fallen in love with Apple as a company and what they were doing from a technology standpoint. So I went to school at a small college in Chicago. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio, and just went down to the local Apple retail store. This is in the 2006, and just applied at a local Apple retail store. It was February, and about a week after I turned in my application, I went and followed up. Called them up, and they said, actually, it's, after the holidays, we're not hiring right now. So a little bit dejected, I hung up the phone, and 20 minutes later, just decided to call back, show a little bit of creative, perseverance that, hey, do you have any feedback on my application? I might apply again. And person says, we actually really looked at your resume. Happy to have the store manager call you back with some feedback. And lo and behold, called me back 20 minutes later and invited me to come in for an interview for a seasonal employeeship at an Apple retail store. And that's how I got my first job and in the door with Apple, was just in the Apple retail store. I was there for about a year, and from there I got recruited out into corporate. They have a special program at Apple to this day where they bring retail employees out to corporate for different periods of an internship, and I was one of the first classes to do that. So the same summer the iPhone came out in 2007, I had the opportunity to go to Cupertino for my first kind of corporate internship, which led into my 15-year-long career out there at Apple. So I'm a big believer in just showing a little bit of perseverance and being willing to kind of start at any level. So once you have your foot in the door, sometimes it really takes you into interesting places.
When you mentioned in our call that there was a job that you didn't think you were qualified for, you received a call back.
Yeah, so when I was out in Cupertino on that internship program, one of the recruiters I was talking to sort of said, hey, there's this position that's open right now. This was working on something called iTunes U, which was sort of an educational podcast platform. And, I think you should check out this job listing. And I checked it out. At this point, I was about a year and a half out of college. And so as I looked at the job requirements, it was, 10 years of experience, MBA preferred, right? And I was like, what's the disconnect here? You know this job listing, you know my background, what's going on? And she's like, well, we often, have situations where we talk to people with those qualifications, and we think you have things that, we can't teach, and we can teach you the rest of what we need to know. And so they rewrote the job, kind of requirements. I'm sure they moved some other things around into responsibilities, but my first corporate job at Apple was actually one that was really, kind of one that was written far beyond my years of experience. So again, being kind of in the door helped with that process.
So just to touch on the history of the technology for our audience, in 2007, Apple launched the store, and then in 2008, I think it was open to outside developers, and Mark and I and our group launched the very first app on the College of Charleston campus. It was a walking tour app on Apple, and that was around 2009. We started talking about it, I think, the first year that the store was open. And iTunes U was something faculty were looking at and experimenting, thinking, is this something that's viable? Would anybody can watch this? Can we charge students for this? Fast forward to the pandemic, of course, the entire country is doing remote classwork. And that all happened in about a 13-year time span. So it's very interesting how that rapidly evolved. So Steve, then let's fast forward to today. Tell us a little bit about QCode and your specific role there.
Yeah, so QCode is a podcast production company and media company. I'm Chief Strategy Officer. We're most known for making scripted fiction podcasts. So these are high-end sound design shows with cast different actors. We have a kids show with Matthew McConaughey and a female erotica with Demi Moore. But sort of movies for your ears, you could say. Each of them are kind of really unique and engaging experience that often are being turned into TV shows and movies. And then in addition to that, we really have unscripted chat shows, chat shows, in traditional podcast formats and variety of genres. So I spend a lot of my time outreaching, working with our partners, recruiting new shows to the network, helping with monetization strategy. It's pretty varied. We're a small company of around 20 people.
So when you're considering a show, either to help produce or fund or distribute, do you feel like that in your gut, this may be a winner? This may be one that really appeals to people? Or is it more like we've brought on board a great team of writers, we have some fantastic guests, several of them are famous, we're going to put it out there in the marketplace and see how it responds? What's the mix of those two?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say they're pretty mixed. I think, certainly on the fiction side, we really consider all the different elements of, the story itself being really engaging and differentiated. Again, these stories are in a range of genres, so they're everything from sci-fi and horror to, drama. And, we also try and put a great team around these, the writers themselves, the directors, so that it's all, really compelling, sonic experience. And on the chat show side, same thing, I think, Ian and I probably spend a lot of time thinking about just different talent and what the different components are that will make a show successful, whether that's somebody who has a following already or somebody who just has something really great to say and, they might, the show might overperform, frankly, what their current reach might be. So
Ian, take us through the founding of Partisan Records and how that evolved into Talkhouse, co-founding that enterprise. Was that something that was necessitated by the economy and evolution? Was it just a natural extension of the type of content you're already creating?
It was both. I mean, the media ecosystem had changed a lot since we started Partisan. When we started Partisan, it was like right before the economy just completely tanked. I mean, it was CDs were kind of going out. The iTunes store was kind of on its way out. But there was a really healthy blog environment. They call it the blog era. There's a really good podcast about it now. But there were like 150 blogs covering music, and people actually read them and read a bunch of them. I would read 10 of them a day, look at the new posts and find new music. And it was this amazing period of discovery. And it started with the local newspapers, like Charleston City Paper. Although Charleston City Paper, I can say nothing but wonderful things about. I used to write for them. They're amazing. They've done a very good job of preserving their art section. But in Atlanta, they have creative loafing. And they didn't. They decided we really don't need arts and music coverage anymore. And that happened all over the country. And then the advertisers also stopped, spending money on blogs. And they just decided it wasn't worthwhile for them. So it kind of created this ecosystem where you just had a few places, like Pitchfork being one, kind of making these decisions for, what's good and what isn't. And so it wasn't a very healthy media ecosystem. And the idea was let's start a media company that is entirely, driven by artists. Artists write all the content, and then that kind of took us into podcasting, where it's there's an opportunity to change how interviews are being done, and change the perspective. And once we got into podcasting, it was a year into it maybe, but corporations started hitting us up, and I think they kind of recognized that there was something unique and special happening. So Samsung gave us a criminal amount of money to do podcast stuff for them. Sonos, followed. They were come in here and program, do these live podcasts for audiences, and we'll kind of make it part of our program. So we did that, and then just sort of we've grown to this network where we support about 20 creators right now, and then we have a lot of shows that are that we sell to places like Apple or iHeart or much bigger companies. And then kind of the next step where we're moving is TV and film. And so with a lot of podcasting, you have this unique intellectual property that you can kind of take it and make it into a nice package and go sell it for TV or film. So that's kind of where we're focused now, is supporting the podcast network, continuing to grow that, but also thinking about getting our creators onto the screen.
So maybe both of you could tackle this with the idea that kind of nothing is new. It does seem like a phenomenal throwback to bring the podcasting and the rise of it is, the public has responded to that and all the way back to the War of the Worlds. And in some ways, you think about radio, that format. Now, today, it's much more on demand. It's not appointment television, appointment radio. But, just in conversations with your producers and your artists, do you also look back through history and think, well, this was successful before and it's interesting, and now there's a new kind of focus on that? Or is that any part of the equation, or is it just this is kind of its own thing within a vacuum?
Well, yeah, I think I think you make a good point, right? Zooming out, podcasts really represent the transition of radio from linear, turn on a dial and get what you get, to on demand. And TV has certainly gone through that with the rise of the streaming era, and that has some fundamental shifts that take place and affordances. No longer does an audience just have to take, and consume a local radio station here in this one city, but they really get that option, that choice. So you have the opportunity to make, as a creator, much more niche content because it's going to be broadly distributed. There are certainly genres that hold the test of time. War of the Worlds is a classic sci-fi franchise. Those sort of things do really well in scripted fiction audio. By the way, we've seen a decline of that kind of content in the U.S., but it was still popular. It's still popular internationally. Like in the U.K., they have a really strong drama and fiction, history through the BBC. But yeah, we think a lot about kind of what we can do in sort of modern technical end of that. So where some of those old radio plays were done with washboards and coconuts from a sound design standpoint, we mix all of our shows in Dolby Atmos, like spatial audio, and try and produce them at the highest level. That said, again, there's certain things that stand the test of time, certain best practices like, maybe not having more than 3 characters in any one scene because, it's hard for audiences to differentiate between who's speaking. So we try and blend the old with the new in many of those fiction shows that we create.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it immediately made sense. I think coming from like a record label background and going through some medium shifts from, CD to buying downloads to streaming, podcasting just clicked super fast. And it was like, oh, this is just radio. I used to sit in front of I'm dating myself in a major way, but I used to sit in front of like a gramophone at my grandparents' house, and they had these like comedy, I don't even know what they're called. They're not LPs, but the very thick records, from like the 40s and 50s. And I would listen to those, and then, like, again, I'm gonna sound old, but like Adam Sandler was putting out these like great comedy CDs when I was a kid. And so just every part of it made sense. I grew up listening to the radio nonstop. I recorded the radio all the time and made mixtapes and different kind of like combinations of words and music when I was a kid. And yeah, I mean, it was just kind of like, and coming from a place, I mean, I managed artists for 15 years. And from working with talent in that way, it was like, oh, this is a way to hook in this audience and create this parasocial relationship where it's like, I can put talent directly into your ears 3 times a week. And you can have this crazy relationship with that talent. You'll go, pay money to see them live and stuff. It just clicked in for me. I was like, this works super well. And the advertising environment then was amazing. It was sort of that, what TV shows used to be, which is like, Johnny Carson presented by Colgate. And it was kind of, it just felt, like it was built in and really meaningful. It's more of a sponsorship model. And the number one thing in my career, and I'm very upfront about this, is I love taking money from corporations with as few strings attached as possible. Creating this like very independent environment for talent where they're not beholden to corporations, but where we're taking the bag every time, as much money as we can and putting it in talent's pocket. So I saw that with podcasting. It was like, oh, this is a play. This is a move where we can do this.
Yeah, there have always been shows like the King Biscuit Flower Hour that introduce people to the blues, or Wolfman Jack being syndicated around the country. So let's look at the business standpoint for a minute. Take us through the whole 360 degrees of how you monetize something, whether that's through the show itself, merchandising, advertising, a subscription model, a tour. There's so many ways to generate that revenue. How, we have some creators here in the audience, what should they be considering, let's say, in the early stages of something they're going to put out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really like thinking about it, in multiple different ways. So you can make something to sell, and that's great. You can also partner with something that exists and make something special and new, like a collaboration. We have talent that does that all the time. We work with Allison Roman. She's amazing at that strategy. She makes her own stuff. She partners with brands, and they do limited edition things. So on the merchandise front, it's sort of like the world is your oyster. It's not hard to find create things that people will pay for. I think where it gets tricky is like the marketing of it all. It's finding the audience. Like you can make the thing that people will pay for, but then how do you let people know that it exists? And I think, frankly, that has gotten pretty hard. As big tech has sort of changed its algorithms, and they want you to keep paying for ads, and spending money to make money. So I think part of it, I've always thought merch was really easy. I thought the really hard part is like, finding the people to buy it.
So it all goes back to the KISS Army and Kabuki makeup and joining that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about from the QCode perspective?
Yeah, I think in kind of in some of the different categories you can certainly the podcast business is hopefully a diverse ecosystem. The number one way that podcast media companies make money today is through advertising. The vast majority of the money today is spent by what are called direct response advertisers. So that's where you listen to a podcast and they say, go to this website, use this promo code, get this 20% off. That's ultimately how the advertiser knows whether the ad is converting for that brand. And there's a sort of ROI based on their the return on ad spend based on that show. There's also brand ad dollars too, which you can go after through either selling into an existing podcast or trying to pre-sell a show you want to make to a brand. And then certainly emerging categories like merch, like touring, like subscriptions, which is something we do as well. So that's been a recent addition in a lot of podcasts is getting bonus content through Patreon or Apple Podcasts to really satisfy those fans who just want more of the creators that they love, or maybe an ad-free experience.
Are there any really career-defining moments for either of you where you just realized that I got to make a pivot here or a change, and maybe you had to think it through, or maybe it was just obvious right in front of you that an opportunity presented itself?
I'll maybe jump in. I mean, so just a little bit back to my my Apple days. I was at Apple for maybe about 8 years. 2014 was when I shifted over and I started working on the Apple podcast team. At the time, iTunes podcast, and podcasts were kind of not looked at as that interesting or cool at the time. I had some friends who even suggested it was a career dead end to go work in podcasts. The company itself wasn't investing a lot at Apple, but also a lot of people weren't listening. They hadn't discovered the medium yet in the way that they have now and found their favorite show. And it was in the fall of 2014 when Serial came out, which was a big #1 hit true crime show. Kind of arguably the first sort of global #1 podcast. There's some great tech advancements that have come around at the same time, like the podcast app had become pre-installed on every iPhone with iOS 8, and Bluetooth was enabled by default. So you saw this real kind of case study convergence of content and technology coming together. But it was sort of from that time forward that it really felt like something had shifted in media and with publisher interest. And I think for a lot of consumers, they'd found this idea that, there's this really great medium that I can listen to what I want, when I want, in a range of genres. And that's what we're up to now. We have these fiction shows at QCode, but we have chat podcasts with dating and relationship, or there's a really great podcast we have at QCode called Unplanned with Matt and Abby. They're fantastic. But just a range of genres, range of content, and really diversified, I think, who was listening to podcasts. And it felt like from that sort of October 2014 time, just everything sort of shifted.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of like moments. Like I helped Bill Murray get dressed into like a Peter Pan costume once on the David Letterman show. But I also, I have a lot of cool moments where I was like, oh, it's like crazy that I get to do this and get paid and live pretty well. The thing I think about a lot in my career is like the metaphor is like the VHS factory, where it's like at some point, something becomes obsolete, something you're working on or your passion for something, and you just have to move on to the next thing. And I always think about like it's the VHS factory, where it's like VHS were great. We grew up with that technology, it was amazing, watched movies that way, but then something better came along. And so I think about that a lot as a kind of transition from one thing to another. I mean, we're not talking about like all the different companies I've started that haven't gone very well. We're just talking about the couple that, have become profitable and become pretty valuable. But I've done, I don't know how many things. I mean, my first thing that I did in Charleston was like, I have a tattoo of the logo on me. But it failed spectacularly, and it was amazing because I knew exactly why it didn't work and what I needed to do next to hopefully make the next thing successful. The first thing was a record label and management company, and I just sort of faded away, and then I started Partisan, and it was doing the same thing just differently, with the lessons from the first time. So I have a lot of those moments, and I always think about that, that factory in town where you're like, that thing is not long for this world. It's going to go under. They're making something that no one cares about anymore. And that's fine. You just have to kind of be at peace with that, and and start thinking about what's next, and not rushing into it either.
So, looking back, what advice would you give to any of the students today who maybe, or anybody else here who may be a creator? Let me be more specific. Is it necessary today to move to another market to successfully launch something like a podcast, a record label, a band, etc.? Or is that less important than ever? What are your feelings on that today?
I mean, here's the deal. I left Charleston, and initially it was super cool. I was in New York, and I was young and could go out all the time and be fine. And it wasn't long before I wished I was back here. And flash forward, 5 years ago I bought a house back here, and now we kind of split our time between New York and Brooklyn. But I don't think so. I mean, what I recommend to people, and just as transparently as possible, is, try and do something here. The other thing you can do is go to New York or LA, work in the mailroom of CAA or William Morris, or, any of these big giant agencies, or do what Steve did. Steve lives in Cincinnati where his family is, which I always think is just so cool. We're underselling him, but he's the kingpin of the podcast industry. And gets to live wherever he wants. And as you get older, and this is something you guys shouldn't know right now, but if you start thinking about a family and stuff, you start thinking about places that aren't New York and LA. And so for me, Stan knows, this has been a 6-year, try and get back here in time for kindergarten, so I don't have to drive all over Brooklyn, spending my days dropping kids off and picking them up with no parking, or, yeah.
So Steve, let's go a little deeper into that on the hybrid model today. We're all old enough, the three of us, to have straddled, pre-pandemic in the professional world and looking at it today and what that looks like. How do you guys manage your remote teams, and what's the upside and the downside to that?
Yeah, I'm really pragmatic when it comes to this topic, especially after we've all gone through COVID and learned how to work more remotely. We have an office in LA. I live in Ohio, as Ian mentioned. We have some other employees that are based all over, including our head of sales, actually, that's based here in Charleston. So we tend to be really pragmatic with just trying to find great talent wherever they are, and that's true of our shows too, by the way. We have creators on our network who live in Montana, just made a really awesome podcast. So we try to think about it pragmatically, to speak to the benefits of being someplace like Silicon Valley or New York or LA. There's a certain level of serendipity that happens, right, when you're in some of those places. When you go to a little party and you realize there's somebody from NASA and Google and Netflix all kind of there, getting in the room is really cool. And if you can do what it takes to get out there and have those experiences, I think it could be really worth it for, at the very least, a period of time. But it just really depends on your situation and, your sort of overall life goals and family goals.
Yeah, the thing, I have a ton of employees. We went all remote in the pandemic and really haven't gone back. And we have a number of offices now. Especially on the record label side, we have a really big London presence. We have about 15 people over there, and we have an LA team as well. But this was before the pandemic. Going way back, maybe 10 years ago, I had this girl who, she interned for me. Very smart, University of Virginia graduate. And one day I got a call from my friend Justin Eshak, who's now the head of Island Records, and he was like, hey, what do you think of Annie? and hung up the phone and was like, Annie, you're hired. You're my assistant now. And then, I think it was just before the pandemic, she was like, my husband and I want to have a kid and I want to move back to Virginia and I want to be a project manager at the label. And she laid it all out. And, look, I couldn't square losing her. So I was like, okay, sounds good, whatever you want. And she's still like, she runs the show at the record label these days. I mean, she is as senior as it gets, living in Charlottesville, like 2 kids now, amazing situation. And with that, it's always like, I couldn't lose her. She's the hardest worker. She's so smart. And I never even had a role. It wasn't like she came into the company with some special expertise. I mean, she was fresh out of college. I had no idea what she majored in. I couldn't tell you, but she worked so hard and was so intuitive and smart and could kind of figure out. She started as my assistant when I was managing bands and doing that stuff, and now she's running this crazy logistical operation for the record label. So the point being, now when I hire people, I think about that. It's I'm not hiring for how to do exactly this. I'm hiring for I believe you're going to work really, really hard, and that you're going to be able to figure things out, and that you're going to be able to work well with the team, and kind of fit in culturally in a way that makes people feel good. And if that's somewhere else and you can do it remotely, totally great. I'd probably rather that than have somebody in a major market where it's more expensive and there's just going to be these external pressures to really do well. And that's been hard in New York. I have people that are living in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and it's I know they need more money because it's so expensive to live there now, but I'm like, you better make something awesome happen. It's sort of, as an employer, that's the part where it's you need to really kind of create your own business unit or kind of show me that it's there to get to that next level. And a lot of people do it. And some people, I think it's a challenge, but it does kind of go into thinking about sort of well, where are they and what are kind of all the different factors of their employment.
I want to touch on one more topic that is very top of mind for creators and then open the floor to questions. So get ready with your questions here. Back to the idea of this convergence of technology, creativity, and the end product. What are your current feelings on ChatGPT and artificial generative intelligence and what's happening in that space as it relates both to your business model and the individual creator?
Yes. So I think I'd start on the topic, frankly, with just a general thought on kind of what to do while you're in college. I'm a big believer in generalists. The world has gone highly specialized, and personally, I picked this title, Chief Strategy Officer, which is nebulous because I'm not a CMO type. That's never the direction I wanted to go, to be a marketing person. In my career, I had spent a lot of time doing editorial and partner relations and marketing. I was a philosophy major in college, and I took graphic design courses, and I think that was really valued. That's been really valuable for me to have a career that allows me to think across different categories and see how things integrate. And as we think to the future with all kinds of great AI advancements, frankly, the specialist jobs, I think, are the ones that are more at risk and challenged. If you're a great copywriter, and ChatGPT can, get you 75% of the way to great copy, that's fantastic. But knowing how to prompt or knowing how to think about the integration of ChatGPT or other tools and Midjourney and, developing kind of an integrated story across lots of categories, I think is actually most advantageous to be able to utilize these tools. I certainly think some jobs are threatened by AI, but I think it's really the people who don't know how to use those tools, jobs are threatened, versus a candidate who knows how to leverage this technology. Steve Jobs used to talk about the sort of computer being the bicycle for the mind, this idea that, it was a technology that helped advance human creativity. And I think maybe ChatGPT is just the next evolution, or, AI in general is just the next evolution of that.
Yeah, I think about it again, my way I think about it's really dumb, but if you go to Japan, there are these machines, and you could be like, I want spaghetti and meatballs, and there's like a spaghetti and meatballs immediately. You don't see those machines everywhere. It's like, I don't want my spaghetti and meatballs from a machine. And so I think there'll be a place for AI. It'll infiltrate our culture and our art. But I think it kind of comes down to the consumer and whether they want to, consume something that's just created by a machine and doesn't have like a human element to it. So I don't think it's like coming for all of our jobs. I think it's coming for sort of the lowest common denominator. At least in our kind of immediate lifetimes. When it gets really good, then I'll get worried.
Okay, let's open the floor to questions. Yes, Frank.
What benefits strategy question, because your employees are all over. You think, will we get to some trend where you just say, hey, here's $400 or $500 per month, and here's your menu, or go find your own stuff, as opposed to, historically, traditionally, everyone's in one place, manufacturer, whatever, everybody gets the same sort of benefits, and we just hope that, it fits for you. How does that look for you guys? How do you give benefits to your people that are all over the place? And can you do a price cap?
Yeah, I mean, we use like a national payroll company. Honestly, the really difficult part of doing it is taxes, because you're paying taxes in all these states as an employer. But we're sort of used to that because we're used to paying sales tax in all these states where we sell records. But it's been, the record label I started, I guess, 16 years ago. And this has been like a 16-year journey. I've had the same CFO for 14 years. So yeah, there's sort of, it's just a process, and maybe every year you kind of do a reevaluation. Would we be doing this differently? And that's true of the business in general, like, the way equity is structured, or, investor equity, whether it's like, oh, maybe we convert that to debt, or, so these are things you're just kind of constantly rethinking, and change payroll providers, you change healthcare plans, and you try and make something work. The stipend thing is an interesting idea. Like, I kind of love that sort of idea, like the universal basic income just for a certain set of, benefits and things employees need. But maybe we'll get there. We'll see. I think there's a lot of things we could do in this country that would make it just a more livable place in general.
Yeah, I don't have a ton different there. I'll just say it is getting more complicated in certain state requirements. Like, I think, some states are even passing laws that require you provide cell phones or Wi-Fi to certain employees. And it's complicated. Luckily, I don't have to spend a lot of my personal time on that. Like, we have our CFO as well doing a lot of that stuff. But it's definitely a consideration that we think about in terms of, how quickly are we growing the company, how many full-time employees we have versus, contracting on certain jobs, or, partnering with the company on PR versus starting to bring some of that in-house. And, the right speed of growing the company is certainly a consideration.
Bill, something you had a question?
With regards to podcasting specifically, obviously you guys there's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of fragmentation. How are you guys approaching that, and what tools, you alluded to before, the creators, if it's a good product, it's going to rise above. But as you know from the, TV commercials, there's a podcast for everything, podcast for that. So how do you rise above that, and what kind of tools do you use to alleviate fragmentation?
Thanks you.
Well, it's an interesting topic for sure, because it does feel like, there's a podcast for everything now, and you'll hear some of these refrains like, are there too many podcasts, right? And my counter to that is, we haven't run out of topics for books. Books have been around much, much longer than podcasts. Movies and TV, same thing. Do you start to see kind of crowded space, or this idea that there's no new idea under the sun? Absolutely, but yeah, I think if you can make a great story that meets the right audience, you can see some pretty magical things. One of the shows that we have on the network is called Tooth and Claw. It's hosted by a wildlife biologist named Wes Larson. He has his master's degree in wildlife biology, but his specialty was on human-bear conflict. Worked on the bear management team in Yellowstone, literally crawling into bear dens, And each episode of this podcast, Tooth and Claw, is him telling a true tale of a wild animal attack to his brother and his friend. And they're hilarious and fun. They talk about these pretty gruesome wild animal attacks, but they also talk about how to stay safe in the outdoors. And, it ends up being this really magical kind of, if you love true crime podcasts, it's sort of true crime, but for grizzly bears, I would say, or shark attacks. And if you love the outdoors, you learn a lot from it as well. They started working with us when they were doing about 10,000 downloads per episode. So they already had a pretty scaled audience. Now they're doing close to 100,000 downloads an episode. And growing something like that is hard, It ends up being a mixture of, just trying to get the word out through word of mouth, and combine that with, we have a lot of relationships with podcast platforms like Apple, my old job, my own employer, Spotify, and other platforms, but also just really figuring out ways to earn media for that show, like I'm doing right now. Hopefully you all are subscribing. But over time, those things sort of grow, and you see sort of success beget further success with the show. So, if there was one magic bullet, I think everyone would kill for it. But I think ultimately it is about just the hard work to try and find that right product market fit for a really compelling story, and find all those people who love the outdoors or wild animals that will listen to a given show, if that makes sense. So
Sounds like you should have called it Unbearable.
that would be good. Maybe that's a spin-off show.
Yeah, please.
Steve, first of all, wonderful storytelling. Really glad to have you and Stanfield for providing this opportunity for our students. So from a liberal arts perspective, one of the things, I'm glad you mentioned, first of all, the generalist, the rise of the generalist was the specialist in what AI will do in that area. And Ian, you talked briefly earlier about meandering to college and getting some skill sets. So for the students or liberal arts students in here, I think the future is really bright for you in an age of AI, as you pick up all these skill sets that will make you powerful. What advice do you have to our students to further leverage and promote their liberal arts background or make them more competitive for journeys such as yourself and some companies or firms and be really creative? What advice do you have for liberal arts students to leverage?
Yeah, I really leverage the liberal arts education here. As I was saying, I said it was kind of meandering, but I took some business classes, enough to kind of have a base level understanding, but then also just enough to understand what I didn't know and probably wasn't going to know. Which when I hired the CFO was my third hire. After someone just to package things, because when I started, there was a year where all day, every day, I was just putting things in packages, just constantly putting things in packages. So I hired that person first, minimum wage, and then I brought on the CFO. Once we had some deals in place with distributors and had some business happening, because I had taken a few business courses here, and I knew some basic principles, but also there's a whole world of stuff that is just not going to work for me. It's just not. I have no interest in knowing it. And I'm not going to know it. And so that's that. And I did that with a lot of things. I took a lot of journalism courses here and ended up with a communications major. And those are principles I use every single day. Just as far as processing information and understanding where it comes from, and some of the kind of storytelling that we do. But also with artists, I had a job for a year before I started the record label where I was a publicist, and I was writing press releases. I was Girl Talk's publicist. I got on the cover of Time magazine. And I was just a guy in the building that could write pretty well because I had these awesome journalism classes here at College of Charleston. This sort of I really kind of used it as I can take this and this and this. It's not University of North Carolina or something where I have to in the first year decide I'm going to the School of Business and I'm committed to that. Even in my last year at CFC, I was taking such a weird mix of different things. And ultimately I was granted an independent study, which I really took advantage of. And I created my own curriculum and I worked with Stan on it some. And, it was sort of like a music business kind of thing. but it was amazing. And, there was sort of a level of accountability there, but I was like totally learning the stuff I needed to learn, which was super helpful.
Yeah, I'd say, a few things come to mind. Follow your curiosity. I think that's really valuable to do. I think, have perseverance, take ownership of the things that, that you're responsible for as well. One of the things that was drilled into me kind of early in my career is this idea that, I don't know, let's find out. And just really having that persistent, desire to go after kind of the right answers in a kind of positive way. And when I work with those people, regardless of whatever level they're at, it's really it is a different kind of person to work with. Don't view, yourself as above any given task. We all work really hard, and, having that diverse skill set of knowledge and being willing to be the person to kind of dig in and find the answers to things is really important. I can't tell you the number of times that I helped major media companies troubleshoot things because I, knew a little bit about how to use Photoshop and knew the difference between a file in RGB versus CMYK, right? Very specific information, again, in that generalist mindset, from my Photoshop classes while I was a philosophy major really helped. So anyways, yeah, I'd just say, be curious, be perseverant, and just be willing to work hard.
Yes.
From an entrepreneurial's mindset, what is the best advice to give when facing failure or hardship within a company, going together?
Yeah, I think it's just, you process it and sit with it for a minute and figure out what you can do better, and then just move on, to the next thing. You just kind of keep at it. For me, that's been, I don't know. I think when I was younger, I used to take these small defeats as major, I was losing this huge battle or something. I'd send somebody at Rolling Stone a record and they'd be like, yeah, not for me. And I'd be like, screw you. And now it's just sort of, all that stuff rolls off. The older you get, the more you do things, that stuff doesn't bother you as much. And so that's sort of been a part of it. You just kind of get a tougher skin. But going into it, just knowing that it's kind of going to be that way. You're going to have to bang down a lot of doors and really just be persistent. If you just kind of go into it knowing that, then you'll be fine. You'll figure it out. We're super adaptable, and as long as you're open to that, it'll happen.
Yeah, I think just going along with that, I think a teachable spirit is really important. We had a situation about a week ago where, without going into all the weeds, a technical issue happened and all of our podcasts were not available. Just suddenly, you could not play them. We couldn't figure out what happened. And, short story, it was, because a change had been rolled out kind of across all of our shows. And as we figured it out, we just sort of reflected as a team, hey, if we're going to do that again, one, we need to communicate a little bit better internally that we're going to make a change. And maybe we should try it, in a bit more of a processed fashion. Try the change on one show and then, make sure it works and then roll it out across. But kind of that teachable moment of, certainly a big failure moment, but was one that, take a lesson from it. And I think hopefully now the team is thinking about it from they're taking the lesson of doing things in processes or doing things in small pieces rather than just rolling something out in a major way. So, I think every failure does present an opportunity to further optimize, kind of what you're doing and think about it in a more strategic and smart way.
Yes, Frank.
I think I heard you say podcasts are movies for your ears, which is a cool tagline. Do you ever think there would be an interest to add some video to the podcast? Not to sort of become a movie, but there is some engagement, inviting engagement in of some video. And I'd love to see some Bear stuff going on while he's talking about the podcast. Will podcasts morph in those ways where they might add some visual as well?
Yeah, YouTube is making a lot of investments in podcasts today, and certainly there's a ton of popular chat shows and video. We have a show called Brain Leak with a big YouTuber named Jacksepticeye. We launched a show called Distractable with a big YouTuber named Markiplier, and then Matt and Abby have Unplanned, and there's a lot of creators on our network who, or even YouTube creators, who are making podcasts chat shows. And, in terms of other kinds of formats, I think it's about finding the right kind of creative to mix with the audio, so that could be sort of B-roll footage or something that will kind of explain the story further. We try to be really strategic about that. Could you use, video across all shows? Maybe, but one of the beauties I think of this medium is that it does provide for that kind of imagination, and so you kind of let the listener, kind of have that opportunity to interpret the story in the way and see the characters in the way that they want, maybe as they're driving on their commute. So we are doing a lot more in video, but we're also trying to do that, not do that at times when we think it would, frankly, not add to the story. So it's just really, something we're all trying to figure out in the industry right now.
So just to follow on it, so Mannheim Steamroller, if you ever remember 20 whatever years ago, they had the background just sort of, psychedelic kind of stuff or whatever. It was just sort of visual stimulation while you were listening to the music. It wasn't really a story.
Yeah, and there's like such cool things out there. Like one of the things I love, there's music like chill hop and lo-fi beats, and study music you can look up, on YouTube where there's like a little like animated raccoon, like just like studying, or actually there's a whole channel called Old Radio in the Other Room While It's Raining. If you Google that, and it's just like, just soft music and that kind of animated rotational graphic, which, kind of serves a purpose. Maybe it's just a browser window you minimize. But there's, I think, lots of different approaches to how you could kind of start to pair visual with audio.
When I moved to New York, I was really excited. There was a TV station that was nothing but a fireplace. It was turn that on and sit by the crackling fire. Is there anything really surprising that you've discovered about the audiences with podcasts? Like, wow, 80% of them are delivery drivers, or 30% are people who are waiting to get their children, and it's cool. Have you been able to determine any unusual demographic information about them? I know it depends on the show.
Yeah, ours are so different, and that's one thing I love about it. I think there really is like something for everyone in the space, and you can create this like really intense connection between, the show and listeners. So I don't know. Our shows are they're all over the place. They're mostly focused on music and film and art. Now we have, like I said, Allison Roman, who's sort of this like, millennial Julia Childs or something, and that's like a totally new audience. That's the thing that I think is cool. Like, it really is an open medium right now, which which isn't very common. You mentioned like the lo-fi, like I hate that stuff, like these sort of pre-programmed playlists, because they are trying to kind of, it's like aesthetic over art. The nice thing about the podcast space is like you kind of, if I'm into like, ceramic sculptures of kittens or whatever, there's probably something I can listen to that like, feeds that. I listen to the weirdest like Australian surfing podcasts, and like if any of you listen to it, you'd be like, this is like listening to a foreign language, but to me it just hits me where my interests are. So
yeah, certainly on the programming side you can be really specific in that way because you can you're reaching the globe. But yeah, I think what's amazing about the audio medium is it is often a different modality. There's so many things competing for our visual attention.